Thank you for joining us again today. We're back in our series regarding the Royal Commission. Today we're looking at recommendations and the big picture. I'm joined again by Dr. Peggy Brown, former Royal Commissioner, and Professor Harry McConnell, neuropsychiatrist.
The Royal Commission made 122 recommendations in our final report, and they were they were clumped, I guess, in under different topics. I think probably the most important one that we thought was most important was the last recommendation, which was to see an independent statutory entity set up to follow the Royal Commission that could continue to monitor this space, to oversee the progress in terms of implementation of the recommendations, but more than just, checking whether things had been implemented, was to see what impact the recommendations were having, and if necessary, to make further recommendations to continue to drive the reform that's necessary to ultimately reduce veteran suicide. And the reality is that, defence environment will continue to change into the future. So a recommendation that was made in 2024 is not necessarily going to address the changed circumstances that might be there in 2029. So it is really important that there is this continual eye on the issue, and that actually ensures that real change is occurring.
Mm-hmm.
And so I might just break it down in terms of defence and then in terms of DVA. We made a recommendation which might seem like a really simple one for defence, which was basically saying they needed to recognise that to achieve optimal operational capability, they had to look after people's well-being, health and well-being. Now that sounds really simple, but what we found was that they were not focusing on health and well-being. The focus was predominantly on operational readiness and capability, often at the expense of individuals' health and well-being. And so that's kind of like an overarching recommendation, and then sitting under that are lots of other recommendations. So it's about ensuring that you address sexual violence, which was so prevalent. It's about ensuring that you have a fair and just, military justice system, and we had a lot to say about the issues there. It's about ensuring that you have health services that cover what's required from prevention through to, treatment, rehabilitation. And it's about looking after families and things like, service life. So the frequency of postings and, training. So pretty much all the other recommendations kind of sit under that other recommendation. And then in terms of DVA, I think the one recommendation that I would point to there was the need to have an agency that actually focused on veteran wellbeing. Because again, a lot of things kind of sit under that. So that would be my response to what's the top three.
It is absolutely critical, because while people are in defence, they have their own sort of silo of medical services that are available to them, completely independent from everything else that every other Australian citizen has. And when they leave, they suddenly need to go into the civilian world, and that can be a very bewildering thing, because the civilian world is full of lots of different segments and silos, and navigating your way between the private system, the public system, does take a lot of assistance. And this is where I think DVA should be playing a really key role. Lots of people, when you look at DVA, a lot of people think, oh, well, this is all about the assessment of the compensation. But really, I see their role much more in terms of helping the veterans go from that siloed medical situation that they have as a defence force member to navigating a very complex civilian medical system, and making sure that the veterans get their well-being looked after, get their medical care, their orthopedic care, their mental health care, all coordinated. And that, I think, is, in my mind, the most important thing that DVA should be doing in helping to coordinate that. So, there's very little communication at all between the defence medical system and the civilian medical system. And DVA can play a really important role in helping those veterans to get the treatment that they absolutely need, because there's a massive treatment gap there.
Well, I guess the first thing I would say is, as a former Royal Commissioner, I'm not privy to any inside information in terms of what's happened since the Royal Commission. So what I know is what I read in the public domain. And government responded to the recommendations of the Royal Commission within a couple of months, which was great to see. And of the 122 recommendations, they accepted in principle 104 of them. They noted 17 of them, and noting means that they needed to consider them a bit further before they could actually make a decision about their response. And there was only part of one recommendation that they did not accept. So in terms of what's happened since then, I guess what the information I've got to go on is what I've read, and particularly Minister for Defence Personnel and Veterans Affairs in September, on the anniversary of the Royal Commission report, made a speech, and he did talk about what they've been doing. I think from memory he said 9 of the recommendations have been implemented in full, and progress was being achieved on 110 of the recommendations. So that's 119, which is more than they accepted. So that is positive. Having said that, really, from my perspective, it's great to see action occurring, and the Minister did refer to a whole range of things that are happening. I guess the proof is in the pudding, though, isn't it? And it's not just about taking action to do something in response to a recommendation, because the Royal Commission commented multiple times about the nearly 770 recommendations from previous reviews and inquiries that really hadn't achieved a lot of change. So, and that wasn't because they weren't all implemented. I mean, some of them weren't, but the majority of them had action taken. It just didn't achieve the change that was required. And so it's good to see change happening, but really we need to ensure that it's achieving what it's intended to achieve. And so that the measurement of that is really important. I don't think there's necessarily ill will been at play there, but oftentimes it's kind of like, okay, tick, done that, and not taken that step to actually say, has it made a difference? There's naturally, in anything in life, there's resistance to change, and you can achieve a change, but if you don't sustain the effort, it will revert back to what it was fairly quickly. And I think we saw a lot of that. So there's a whole host of reasons why change may not necessarily be affected or sustained. And what we need with the Royal Commission is that long-term view. And this is where the Defence and Veterans Services Commission, that independent statutory entity, is just so important to ensure that change is actually occurring. But the other point I would make is that what we're talking about here, just as I talked in an earlier episode about the complexity of the system in which the change needs to occur, the change itself is complex, achieving it because of the big system. And it is going to take time. And I think we just need to recognise that, no government is going to get to the end of 12 months and say we've done it all tick, or even 2 years. I would be very suspicious if they said they had achieved that. So, it will take some time. Yes, the recommendation that was not accepted was in relation to changing the service differential. So currently, if you are injured in a warlike operation and you are permanently impaired as a result of that, you get a higher level of compensation than if you are injured in a non kind of, in a peacetime or just, training situation, for example. Now, our rationale in saying that they should do away with that service differential was, if you're impaired, doesn't really matter how you
Where you were.
how you sustained that injury. You have the same level of impairment. It has the same impact on your life. People will argue that putting your life on the line in a kind of combat situation warrants a higher level of compensation. The Royal Commission basically said that's already remunerated via another way in terms of the payment that people receive for going into combat zones, etc., tax-free allowances, that kind of thing. So that kind of exposing yourself to danger is compensated in a different means. And if you actually sustain a permanent impairment or injury, then it shouldn't really matter how that occurred. The impact on your life is the same. And we heard so many times from people who had sustained, impairments or injuries, say, during training at home, impacted their life forever and felt very bitter that they were treated differently to those who experienced the same injury but in a different setting. Well, that's essentially what the Defence and Veterans Services Commission is hopefully going to be. Now, government did include the establishment of that in the new Vets Bill that was passed in February this year. They have said that they will ultimately put it in its own legislation so that it sits alone, but it has to be independent. It has to have powers to be able to go to agencies like Defence and DVA and others and say, we want to see what you're doing about this. They have to actually understand the issues. It's not, have you done an action, as I was saying before. They have to actually understand what's the issue underpinning those recommendations and what needs to change. And then they have to have the courage of their convictions, really, to be able to hold Defence, DVA, government accountable. And it's not just the federal government. States and territories have a role to play here as well. Now, a Commonwealth body can't necessarily hold the states and territories to account in that sense, but I think morally they can be raising the issues with states and territories as well. So what does it look like, Harry? It looks like a very passionate, committed, dedicated entity that understands the issues and is driving to make sure that change happens and that it's sustained.
Thank you both for today. I think the big important thing that's come out of today is that the implementation is key and the recommendations, but measuring the outcomes and being fluid with outcome measurements and accepting the change and changing regularly and looking at the environment and the social circumstances and situations so that those outcomes can regularly be updated and achieved is really, really important. So I think be open to change, accept change, look for the outcomes, and keep reaching to improve the lives of your loved ones and the veterans around you. Thank you both for joining me today.